So my presentation is just titled "The Next Decade in Remote Work." I'm Nicholas Sledgianowski. We've all been really working remotely for like the last year, almost a year and a half for some of us, and it's been kind of a huge change. Some of us were already working remotely. Some of us were kind of like holdouts, like myself, who really felt they were more productive in the office, kind of enjoyed like the social interaction. But at this point, we've all kind of figured out how to work remotely. So this is kind of some thoughts on the next decade and kind of how it'll be going forwards, I guess. I don't know. And we'll can discuss and have your views and whatnot afterwards. So I'll try not to take too long, even though I think this is my longest presentation by slides, but it doesn't need to take that long. So not everybody wants to work remotely. Amazon, we're officially returning to the office. I don't know what we're doing unofficially. So a lot of people are heading back to offices nowadays, kind of like wrapping up the pandemic. Lots of people are vaccinated now. So a lot of companies just want to go back. Originally I was going to like have different groups of people who want to go back to the office, but it's like micromanagers, extroverts, the HR departments, a lot of people who have like job reasons they want to go back. And then there's people who just want like more social interaction. They like commuting for whatever reason, that kind of thing. And I don't think I can see the hand icon. How did you see the hand icon, Mason? So next slide is just like the negatives of remote work. So again, I kind of mentioned this already. So we got social isolation, communication difficulties. Some people are slacking off and it's harder to kind of like keep track of that. Siloing is another issue. If you can't see other teams, do they even exist? How do I know what they're doing if I can't see them? And some of it's just like the data platform team or like our BI team. I used to be able to walk over and see them, or they come over and like kind of, have you seen this blip in the metrics? Now I haven't talked to them in ages. I don't know what they're doing. They're just kind of existing somewhere. Bad audio equipment is another one where it can be hard to hear people, and just getting the right stuff is kind of tricky sometimes. So then I personally think remote work is here to stay. I don't know. I don't think it's going to be like this last year. It'll be more flexible, but there's a lot of benefits. So one of the big ones is just time savings without commuting. I did some numbers, some estimation, but we're looking at like, if you're commuting for an hour a day, that's roughly 10 days per year that you're spending commuting. If you add it up across the workforce, it's just a huge amount of time. People are just driving around to get to offices. There's the environment. Go ahead.
Is that 10 days, 10 waking days driving, or is that like
10, 24 hours? 10, 24-hour periods. Because you're basically, I did 2,000 hours a year, which is like 40 hours a week. And then you divide that by 8, you get a number of days. If you commute every day for at least an hour, which is like 30-minute commute each way.
So it's like a month's worth of 8-hour days.
Yeah, it's quite a lot of time.
Yeah. Not even that. Sorry, but we spend more time in a car if you drive an hour a day than you get vacation. I'd rather have the vacation and just not commute.
Yeah, it's a significant amount of time. But yeah, 10, 24-hour periods. And then environmental, there's a lot of driving that's going on. The government usually estimates that driving costs are about 50 cents per mile. So you get to write off 50 cents per mile if you're driving for a business. If you're working and you're commuting, you don't actually get to write that off, sorry. But that's like over $5,000 a year. That's an average commute. I took off the internet somewhere, so we don't know how accurate it is. But if you're driving an hour each day, that's a pretty good amount of distance. And then air pollution is an issue here in Arizona. They actually have like emissions testing and stuff because we get a lot of just like smog from cars in the valley here. There you go. So now one of my thoughts is that most startups will be remote companies going forwards. And kind of like 3 real reasons is there's no fixed office costs if you're remote. And a lot of companies will have like fixed leases and you have to like set up the office, and that's pretty expensive. And if you only have like $250,000 of seed money, maybe you don't want to spend all of that on an office. easier access to cheaper talent. If you're working remotely, you don't have to compete with Google for talent in San Francisco or San Jose. You can hire from anywhere in the country. You can hire internationally. You have a lot of options. So that's going to, because a lot of the price increases is driven just by trying to fit so many people into the Silicon Valley and like Seattle. And then the last one, this kind of higher process bar, it's kind of my thinking is there's a lot of things you have to do right to have the remote work be more effective than being in an office. And those things kind of improve your effectiveness in general. So it's kind of like if you meet the bar, then you'll be more successful. If you don't meet it, you'll be less successful. So it's kind of, I mean, it'll be interesting going forward and like how the process develop. So office costs, kind of looking at this. But if you're in an open office and you have like 50 square feet per employee at $30 a square foot in like the Denver metro, you're looking at quite a bit of money per person. And then I also just looked at an estimate for a WeWork hot desk, which is like $500 a month, but that's not an assigned desk. It's like a spot at a table. So I don't know if that's 50 square feet or not, but you're looking at like $500 to $1,500 a person just in office costs. And then, so you're also looking at like a 3 to 5 year lease, and startups don't have credit. So you're probably going to be personally guaranteeing a 3 to 5 year office lease for however big your startup is. Let's say you succeed a lot and you're growing a lot. Well, you're not going to have that same space for 5 years. You're going to need to expand. That's just lots of problems. Office furniture, like the cost of everything adds up. There's chairs, there's equipment, there's all this stuff. I personally don't like the office furniture that they have. I have my own chair that I like, which is probably more expensive. I don't know exactly, but it's definitely a cost. And if you're a startup, you have limited runway. So the second one is there's easier access to talent. So you have limited time and money, and it can be very difficult. Like if your startup is somewhere and then Amazon is across the street, that puts a lot of pressure on you on who you can hire and how much you have to pay and that kind of thing. And then there's also limited talent because a lot of those people are already working for Google, so you can't hire them. But yeah, remotely, there's a massive pool of talent. You can basically hire anyone in like 3 or 4 time zones, which is a very large number of people. And then lower salaries. This isn't really an advantage for software engineers, but for startups, having lower salaries is great. And for me, honestly, I could take a significant pay cut and not live in Seattle and be ahead in my own limit. So it's kind of a win-win scenario. And then the last one is kind of like the higher process bar. This one is where kind of like not as clear cut on how it's really a benefit, but you kind of have to have better process. You have to actually like document things. You have to build your architecture and like share information a lot more effectively. You can't just like be walking along and you're talking to people and then you're like, oh, let's go on the whiteboard and explain this. And there's also a tendency to like silo the architects or the lead engineers, and then they aren't talking to the actual people who are coding things, and it can be kind of difficult to like maintain that communication. So kind of what happens next. Welcome back to the office, everyone. June 30th, I think, is the official date for me. But yeah, basically 95% of us have all been working remotely for the last year. Most of us are probably going to be going back at least a few times. Many of us not. It really depends on what you want and what your goals are. I kind of expect the hours work to be more like 80% in office, 20% remote. My team before the pandemic actually had no meeting Wednesdays, and we worked remotely on Wednesday. So we were already 80-20 before the pandemic. So it may actually be higher. My boss is looking at what our regulations are, if I can go full remote or not, or what the deal is. And another thing is, I think a lot of companies are going to be continuing to offer partial and full remote work just to remain competitive, because it's a benefit you can offer that doesn't cost you any money, really. So it's a lot of employers are going to have to offer that. One thing I think is going to come up is there's going to be a in-office premium. So it costs me more to work in the office. So you should probably pay me more if you want me to show up to the office. And I think some of the companies that have stronger positions in the job market, like Google or Amazon, or just like these big name companies, people want to work there. So their competitive position is against each other. It's against like 10, 20 companies that can pay at certain levels, but it's not against all like the less famous companies. So some of those companies will be able to say, oh, you have to work in the office, and people will have to put up with it. But if you're not a top tier company, it's going to be hard for you to not offer remote work for people. One interesting area that I've been looking at a little bit is that there's a lot of legal hurdles around working remotely for employers. So in the United States, like if you have a remote employee in like Texas or Florida or California or whatever, suddenly your business has like a legal presence in that state. You have to start dealing with like local state laws. You may have to register your company as being like a California company or a Nevada company or something along those lines. So in the US, it's a little bit tricky, and we're just one country. But if you go internationally, it's even more wild. So for technologically, as long as I have internet, I could do my job in Belgium, I could do it in Arizona, I can do it in Japan. Only issue is like scheduling meetings. But legally, if I work in France for a month, I'm entitled to French employee protections. So you can't fire me without like cause. And if you do, it's like a 6 months process. It's very expensive. You get certain like amounts of vacation days are required. And that's just if you, let's say you take a flight to France and you're in France for a week. Well, legally, you're an employee in France during that time, and your employer has to have a French legal presence and that kind of thing. So it's actually pretty hard, even though from my perspective, I can just be in France for a week and not tell anyone, and nobody will really notice unless they're like monitoring my IP that I'm connecting from. Another thing is tourist visas typically don't allow you to work. So a lot of people will like work under the table, or they'll just have savings or whatever if they're traveling. But if you really want to make a long-term, technically legally, you can't do it on a tourist visa if you're working. And then I kind of talked about registering. I have a very good Hacker News comment that I have in my references that you guys can look at. But yeah, they're basically having to register in every country they have an employee, and they have to register a business. If you have a lot of international employees, suddenly your company has registered in like 50 countries, and it's quite a bit of like, that's a lot of office work, really. So I do think this will change in the future, actually. And especially in like third world countries that really want to attract like higher paid workers and that kind of thing. So like Georgia and some countries in the Bahamas during the pandemic offered like remote work visas where you could pay like 2 or 3 grand and get a visa for 6 months in like the Bahamas or Georgia or wherever, and just work remotely with little bookkeeping, really. The thing is, other countries like the US and Europe and like more of the first world countries, they don't really feel a need to compete for workers. So they haven't changed the laws at all. And another thing is we may eventually have an international standard for remote work. So some of the countries like Georgia and the Bahamas, they may do a legal pact or something where you can use the same regulations, kind of like how the EU, you can move around and work in any of the countries pretty easily. We may have an international thing, but I don't know how to organize that really, or if it'll happen, but it probably will. This is kind of where this is just other perks of working remotely that I kind of noticed. So there's a lot less workplace drama for me, like coworkers they'll like corner you and talk forever. You just don't have to interact with them as much. So kind of like the negatives of people with bad social skills or whatever kind of are watered down. And then you can kind of just appreciate them as coworkers more. Another thing for the corporate culture is unmotivated employees have a lot more opportunities to just do whatever they want when they're working remotely and you're not like micromanaging everyone. So you kind of have to not have things that like encourage people to stick around if they're not happy, like vesting schedules or I don't know, anything like that. Like for example, Google has a vesting on a monthly schedule, whereas Amazon has every 6 months you vest. And that's a pretty big difference when people are like factoring when they quit their jobs or how long they'll remain employed, that kind of thing. And that's something I think people will probably want to change. And then team events are much harder to organize because the team events you can do remotely are kind of like goofy. You can like play some games. You can do Pictionary, which works pretty well. But if you want to do a real team event, you have to like book people flights. You have to get hotels. It's a lot more expensive. And some people enjoy those. Other people try and avoid them, like myself. So I kind of enjoy that. So kind of the remote future for us as the software engineers. I think for professionals, it's gonna be pretty nifty. You can set up your own office, like optimize your equipment, whatever screens you want. You don't have to like get approval or anything. You can just buy all your own stuff. You can work for basically any company. So if you're fully remote, your employer is basically any country in America or anywhere else that can afford you. And I feel like as after this, there's going to be a bit of a there's been an expansion in remote work offered. There's probably going to be a bit of a contraction, but overall, I think there's going to be more opportunities for people who are like permanent remote workers. Although one thing that's interesting is it might be more like self-employment because you have all your own equipment, you have your own office, you kind of set your own terms when you're working remotely. It's very similar to being self-employed. And then kind of more on this, Developer Hegemony is a interesting book, which I think will be more reasonable in this kind of remote working situation. One thing that we could see is wages could be more globalized just because I'm in Seattle doesn't really make me twice as good at coding. So if I'm in Chile, those wages will probably go up. And if you're in India, your wages will probably go up. And in other places, whereas in like San Francisco and Seattle and whatnot, New York, wages may just be stagnant instead of increasing aggressively. I personally think demand for software is going to continue to increase. Basically, everything has software in it. But on the flip side, there's diseconomies of scale in software. So as your software gets bigger, as it gets more complex, it's harder to make changes. It's hard to update. You need more people, and it just gets more and more expensive. But we haven't really seen anything counteract that other than like WordPress or Shopify, where they just solve one use case. But for bigger softwares and more things integrating together, it just gets more and more expensive. And then capable engineers pretty much work on their terms, office, remote, combination. So that's basically the presentation. I wasn't able to see the comments during this, so I wasn't able to like see the hands or anything. So let me end the sharing. How did you manage to do that, Mason?
Can you see the tiles at all?
Yeah, I could see the tiles, but I only had like the mini version.
I have my hand raised now.
Okay. Well, yeah, this is the basically general open questions time. Sorry, I missed the hands.
Chris has a hand raised.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah. So earlier on talking about kind of the cost of office space, I have thought about that before, and I think you make a lot of very good points for startups, which I think already have a tendency, having no experience with startups, I think they have a tendency to displace cost of the business into the employees. But with large companies like Google and any company whose name that you know, basically, I think that's less likely to happen. And so when I thought through this, I thought that remote work was, as a baseline, is somewhat doomed, because there's absolutely no way that paying for an office is going to cost more than paying, relative cost for people working in their house. in terms of like equipment and space. Like it's not going to be close. Like being able to buy in bulk, so to speak, for an office, I think would be far more efficient. And so the two futures that I see, and I'm curious on your thoughts of this, for specifically large companies, well past startup size, they will either permanently offload the cost of an office onto employees and let them go remote. Maybe that's offloaded by cost of living. I know that, like, I live in Massachusetts. The cost of living here is absolutely ridiculous. But it, working in somewhere like Montana, cost of living drops a bit unless you're near a ski resort. So maybe you can offset some costs there. But yeah, I don't see the cost making sense for big companies that are paying for an office and reimbursing employees now, unless employees just take a dent in their salary to work remote.
Yeah, I haven't really run the numbers like very carefully, but I suspect that offices are probably more expensive in the long run, especially if we're talking about big city office space.
Okay.
If it's just like in the suburbs somewhere and you have like office building that's not very great, it's probably price competitive. But if you're talking about like downtown Seattle, downtown Denver, any like major city, those costs are they're phenomenally high. And when you're talking about remote workers and you're hiring people in Montana or wherever, or Arizona, or just cheaper cost of living places, when you combine the wage decreases and the fact that a lot of stuff is just offboarded onto people, and one thing I didn't mention in my talk, which I really should have, is that since the startups I think are going to be more remote, those are going to grow into big companies that are still probably going to be remote. That's the thought, at least.
I guess in the long run, they have a pretty aggressive competitive advantage, don't they? Really, because they don't have any physical bearing anywhere, and they can essentially be everywhere at the same time, right? I think one of the big things that you mentioned that drew my attention was the talent pool, like just having such a large talent pool as opposed to being geographically locked to, hey, look, I only have X amount in this given area. I actually now have all the amount in all the areas. You know what I'm saying? So, but something that you mentioned as well, Nick, that I thought was interesting was the legal implications for the companies. And I didn't know that. I figured that there was something like kind of weird about that, but I'm glad you kind of find some light on it. Yeah.
The legal situation is totally crazy.
I've actually seen it in action within states. Like there are people at my work, even before the pandemic, who are 100% remote. I forget they exist, which is why I'm skeptical of remote long term, to be honest. But one of them grew up and went to school in one of the Dakotas, north or south. I can't tell the difference. I'm sorry. But my company does not have any legal presence in either Dakota. But his family lives on the east side of them, which is close to Minnesota. So he has an apartment in Minnesota where we do have a legal presence, works remote, and his family lives 15 minutes over the state line. This is a uniquely, like, specifically to the US problem, but it's very real and is already affecting people.
Well, it could also be it's not just the US where you have borders where people live on both sides. So it's a lot of, like, you could be in France and Germany constantly. I'm sure they have some way to work that out.
But that's like a country, which makes sense. I think the states catch people. I was surprised to hear that you are limited in which states you can work remote from based on where your company is registered.
Yeah, ways to registration can be maybe have nothing to do with some of the problems that arise. Like, for example, my boss, so I work for a Canadian company, and he had to go through 3 different harassment programs because we have employees in Canada, employees in California, employees in New York. They don't need a presence in those states, but as long as there's an employee from those locations, you have to pass through the regulations of those states. And I also spin off on a completely different point?
Yeah, go ahead.
Alvaro, your point about talent is extremely relevant to my day-to-day, given that Kira's been largely a closure house for a very long time. And that technology choice really sent them very quickly into feeling like they must go remote as soon as they possibly could. given that the talent pool just could not be drawn from locally. And so it can be like, there can be actual influences on like this tech stack relative to how you choose to locate your company. It goes even further. Like right now, the product I'm working on, because of fears about what's available for the talent pool on the UI side, we had to make decisions about our tech stack relative to that talent pool. If Toronto doesn't have enough X type of developers, we're not going to go with that technology because we have to grow on this thing.
Right.
Or conversely, again, speaking specifically to Toronto, it just so happens that a bunch of big ass companies just showed up at the same time very recently and gutted our DevOps team.
Oh, they just hired them all?
They were all in Toronto and they just hired them all. They're gone. Like we got one left, right? So because we didn't have that distribution across locations, they were able to just suck them all up instantaneously within like months. And now we were thankfully going to remove that department anyway, but now it's happening a lot sooner than we really wanted it to. So some real effects on the direct check technology choices can be really.
Yeah, there's a layered complexity to it for sure. That's really insightful, CJ. That point you just mentioned, to be quite honest, is something that I had not even considered. So very insightful, and I think Nick had alluded to it too, where like I think we're kind of in a situation where if the regulations around it don't calibrate to the adjusting market, then the competition is going to go to start looking at other countries as options, right? Nick, you had kind of pointed out to that as well, which I thought it's just kind of cool to see like the meta trends and all that. So
yeah, I think it'll happen. I don't really think that you'll be able to take like a US like FANG, like Google software salary, and take that to like Georgia or wherever. But I think it's probably gonna be pretty high still, like on a global level. If you're a top level engineer and you go to like Chile or something, I think you'll still be able to pull something that's pretty reasonable by US standards. Even
Did you say Chile?
Yeah, Chile.
I was thinking about moving there recently. They're opening up a Google Clouds Center in Santiago, is it?
Yeah, that's the city.
Yeah, so for me, like since I work with they call it a client in the cloud. None of my software is really running remote, like on my machine. I do it all remote. I just need to have a low latency to one of these cloud centers. And so where they're putting these around the world is really going to dictate like where I'm able to get reasonable latency for key presses and mouse movements on what I'm doing. And so I've been eyeballing that one that's in Chile that's going to be coming up here soon as like, I'd be able to potentially work there once it's up.
So you're using like a remote desktop then?
Yep.
Interesting.
So Mason, I have some questions for you about that to make take your real life example and turn it into a talking point. Because like Nick, you mentioned several times that like salaries would adjust as you go remote. So given that Chile is like they predominantly speak Spanish, right? Or is it Portuguese? I think it's Spanish.
Spanish.
Yeah, it's Spanish. It's a Chilean dialect of Spanish.
Yeah, so you'd have to learn a new language. I guess I don't know if you know Spanish. The cost of living would change. There'd be large cultural things. How much of a salary reduction would you put up with to live there? If today your manager said, "Hey, we'll ship you out there. Your workflow won't change, but you get a 50% reduction," would you take that? Would you think on it? That's
50%. Hell yes, I would do 50% in a heartbeat.
I think there's a really relevant Hacker News thread recently that was talking about this fisherman in this village who was the best fisherman of the entire village, and he'd go out to fish for like 30 minutes every day, pull in a couple, like a tuna or something, and then he'd be done. And this businessman came in and he was like, "Hey, if you wanted to, we could start a business and you could be selling this, we could grow enormously." And he's like, "What for? What would I do?" He's like, "Well, then we'll, hire on a bunch of people, we'll go global. And then, in 20 or 30 years, you'll be able to retire and then move to a small village and go fishing." And like for
Wait.
me, I'm looking at like what I'm doing with my day to day right now. Yeah, saving money is nice, but I think I'm going to regret not actually like living near my family or having a lifestyle that day to day I'm enjoying the people that I am around and like the view that I have and contributing to the community. You know, like those things are really important to me. And you know, like I found some of that stuff in Seattle, but my family's not here. Like, yeah, it's a coronavirus, so it's a little bit harder for me to like get out and volunteer and meet a whole bunch of people. But like in my day to day, that's mainly like top of mind for me. And so if I felt like I could find those things in Chile, then I would take a pretty serious pay cut to go there. I mean, like, yeah, I need to pay off my student loans, but beyond that, you know, as long as I'm able to save and be comfortable, then that's two of the most important things.
I think a lot of why wages are so high for in like San Francisco and Seattle in particular is just because San Francisco became such a intense like software area that you're basically paying to fit the programmers into the city more so than for like the actual tech talent. And there's also the sense that like Google and Amazon all want people and like a voracious appetite, so that's also pressing up. But a lot of it is just like the insane housing prices. If it costs $1 million or $2 million for a house in San Francisco and you want people to work in San Francisco, and if they don't live in San Francisco, it's still like a 1 or 2 hour commute, you have to pay more. It's like there's no, and they just basically stuff the city to capacity.
Right. Well, there's the curiosity of California where you can't do a non-compete, right? So like
But you could do a non-compete in a lot of states.
yeah. But I think
Relatively few.
it was early. It was early in California, if I remember correctly. And that's kind of what spawned the whole like, you know, one-upsmanship that comes from these like, you know, switching job to job to job and then rising salaries coming out of that.
So I posted some stuff in the chat because Nick had some interesting points on the GDP of Chile. I did a really quick Google search, cost of living calculator, and this random website, Numbeo, suggests that if your salary in Denver is 100K, you need 55K in Chile, in Santiago specifically, because I think you mentioned that place, Mason. But
It's basically Santiago is the city in Chile. It's
Yeah.
you're either
So-
it's basically it's many countries only have one major city, and that's kind of where
Yes.
things are.
So it's possible that by focusing on that city, we're kind of missing the point. I am surprised to see it that high. I was expecting a larger delta.
Especially when per capita GDP is only 15 grand for Chile. So
Yeah,
something it's gotta be.
income graphs are always just power distributions. So like if the 20% wealthiest people in the country live in Santiago, they're going to make twice as much as everyone else, something like that.
Yeah.
It's
And I mean,
not even
kind of
close to.
my thinking for software engineering is, let's say we go to the maximum of remote work and every software engineer, wherever you are, you're competing with everyone. You don't have a wage premium for being in America. But the thing is, software programmers are still going to be like one of the highest paying jobs in the world, just in my opinion, at least. So even if, let's say we all go to India, wages, programmers are still pretty high up there on the scale of different jobs.
Honestly, on big picture, I suspect that software, like pure software, is going to become niche, and it's going to become just kind of a baseline thing that you need for other fields. So like if you're working in mechanical engineering, you'll be expected to be able to contribute to the simulation code, which will, the technical complexity there will be dominated by the complexity of the simulation, which needs the mechanical engineering background, which I'm not qualified to contribute to. I can tell you why your code doesn't compile, and I can help you make it run faster on a GPU, but that's where my software training ends. And I suspect that we'll see more of that. Right now, if you dual major in computer science in some kind of engineering field, you can be quite valuable, because software is either total black magic or very hard for most people.
Yeah, the weird thing though is if you just do pure software, you're actually more valuable, which is super annoying for those of us who are multidisciplinary.
What do you mean by that?
So
That
if
makes
you, let's say you go into like the electrical engineering field and you're developing software for electrical engineering.
Mhm.
And the fact of the matter is, if you do that, you're going to make less money than if you just do software and you work for Google.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. Software is a weird pay scale.
Yeah, and it's kind of, my next presentation for SledgeConf is going to be about what I call software leviathans, which are kind of like the massive software structures that the FANGs and whatnot do. So I think Susanna had a question. What is everyone responding as companies are opening offices? What do you mean by responding exactly?
CJ also has a question that we can circle back around.
She says they sent a survey. I mean, like, what are you guys' plans for like returning to the office, I guess is the question. So me
Company also sent a
personally,
survey. Oh, go ahead.
I moved to Arizona during the pandemic, so my team is still in Seattle. So I can't really go back to the office, technically. Like Alvaro, are you working remotely or were you actually just in the office still?
Did you guys call me?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was taking a biology break. Yeah, I'm fully remote right now.
But did they like ask you to go back? Like,
No. It's actually, so it's a company in the medical field and it's a startup. So we've been remote the entire time. One of the things that I wanted to mention that stuck out to me was that you talked about something. There's a higher process bar, which is definitely true. It's you can't like, I guess you can't assume that people know what's going on. You know what I'm saying? That's the one thing is like whereas if you're interacting on a one-to-one basis in a more personable way, you can kind of allow your intuition to, pick up the clues. But that's not possible. So the processes do have to be more rigid and I think more available to view by the entire team. So everybody in short knows what's up, if that makes any sense.
yeah, for sure. And you can't like overhear people talking about something and then ask them what they're talking about. What is this other service? Instead, you just don't hear about it until they're like, oh, can you implement this feature on the other service that you didn't know existed until just now? It's just a lot. It's one of the communication things.
So I actually went into the office the other day with a bunch of my coworkers. We scheduled the virtual walk as one of our social events and allowed people to go into the office to walk in person with people or invited them to walk virtually on a meet call. And so we had 7 of us show up at the office and work together. And it was weird seeing everyone in person for the first time. Like even for people, like some of them were smaller than I thought they'd be. Some of them were bigger. Some were exactly like as I kind of thought that they would be. But even still, my brain was like still piecing together that they were a real person. And like something was very odd about seeing them for the first time. But I do recall actually being in the office and being able to have like just a normal fucking conversation with somebody behind me and being within earshot of other people. These people still like working, but listening at the same time. And I'm like, holy shit, this is so weird. Like I'm like communicating to more than one person right now. And it really just does bring back like, well, it to me, I've been kind of focusing on this more recently is like this, how we treat space in the digital world that they're like, it's all very siloed. Like you start a one-on-one chat and like there's no one that can overhear that unless it's like the people who maintain the platform or admins or something like that. And to have somebody just like kind of enter it, it has to be a very deliberate thing, and they kind of come in and they have no context. There's no gradual thing. This is a completely new space that you all move to, and so it was just very interesting. I have mixed feelings about it, having kind of worked remotely for my entire career. Part of me almost feels like that should be like a sticking point for me. Like, I've never worked in person. Why start now? But at the same time, I think that I might really kind of prefer it. I mean, especially working at Google, they're supposed to have like the most legendary like campuses and just for employee happiness. And for me to just like, oh, you're going to make me go back to that, I'll leave. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I have mixed feelings about it. I'll probably just return to the office with everyone else, but also feel a little bit sad because we're working on Meet and it kind of feels like giving up.
All right, so we're coming up on our next event, which is the promotional roundtable. So any other like questions or thoughts, anyone? This is a great time for those.
DJ still has his hand up.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I wanted to wait because I just had a few extra comments I thought I'd throw into some of the thoughts of your presentation raised, Sledge. But
No, go ahead.
One of the ones is my favorite thing about a more globalized workplace is the mismatched holidays all over the effing place. Which, you know, for some people, right, pure headache. But as a lowly software developer, I have to say the days in which like there's nobody else, because it's like it's Canadian holiday, or it's this holiday, or it's that holiday, and I'm here just because it's not my holiday. It's pretty sweet. Those quiet days where you just like, you know, nobody's gonna bother you actually make me really happy. So, you know, I don't mind that, you know, nobody's Diwali's on, nobody's here from India today. Like, you know, I know I don't have to deal with that department today, and that's good. I'll see them next week. So it's kind of a sweet deal there in some ways for some people.
No, for sure. Like, so in Arizona, during daylight savings time, we're 1 hour ahead of Seattle. The rest of the year, we're on PST. So I would start at like my regular time, but it was actually 8 a.m. in Seattle. So nobody else has started working. I'm just like doing my thing. And then they start showing up like an hour after I started. And then daylight savings time ended, and I'm starting at the same time as everyone else again. It's not as good.
Totally. So it's not as a mismatching. It's pretty sweet. Yeah, but then you get the other headaches. Like we have a team member in Romania, and actually no, he's in Spain now. Anyway, it bounces around. And yeah, we're trying to figure out how to sync things up so that, you know, we can speak at the same time is can be a real challenge. And it tends to, like, you know, that 9 a.m. slot just like fills up. The other thing I was thinking of was something I actually didn't hear about until I'd worked with a more international group. And this doesn't really apply to US citizens quite as much. But so I'm making the assumption here that a lot of remote companies, should they be remote, are still going to want to summit at some point. And maybe majority of them are going to want to try to summit somewhere in the US. And one of the big problems I didn't know about was, you know, there's a kind of general, I think it's Homeland Security, general technology seizure rule, where they can just be like, we'll take your laptop, thanks. You know, like, because we say so.
Yeah.
And while that's probably not going to happen to you or your friend or your friend's friend, like it happens to somebody, and it's enough of a risk that, given the private nature of you know, what's on our laptops, you have to do this like, you know, sort of, I don't know, this wiping tax is what I call it, like where you just either have to wipe the laptop, or you're gonna have to get a different laptop when you arrive at the location and like load everything up, because like at that border, the risk is too great that they'll just take whatever you've got, and now they've got a whole bunch of access to a bunch of stuff you do not want the US government to have access to. So there's that little weird quirks, like those things you don't discover until somebody actually ends up getting in trouble. That really can, and when we're talking on the level of a startup too, can really grind at your time. So thought I'd bring that up too.
It's another reason that like just working from the cloud is nice. You don't have to worry about carrying an expensive laptop around, and you just have to like key in every single time. And if you lose it, fuck it, just get a new one.
Yeah, you can just run around with like a Chromebook or something, and SH in.
Yeah, I think it really would have a lot. I agree, and I think you'd have to convince those who are pushing the angle that like this regulation is so risky that we have to take great measures. So I mean, I think they would hear that and go, but still, like, you know, couldn't they still get access to things? And wouldn't it be better if we just like totally canceled the thing out? But I agree. Yeah, I mean, it's also a good endorsement for maybe some kind of really strong two-factor, where like, you know, I mean, you got my laptop, but you don't have my key. So
yeah, that's how you have to do it. You have to actually have real security instead of just doing it the old school way. So we had a chat question about how many software developers there are in comparison to the population. I think in America it's like 16 to 20 million. Which feels like a good number since the workforce is like, no, maybe 20 million is worldwide.
If we only have 300 million people in the United States, 20 million software engineers seems enormous.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, the workforce is
I
only
thought
like
some-
120 million.
there's some website DAX or whatever that I found estimates like 4 or 5 million in the US. They list the highest percentage of workforce as software developers as Washington, Colorado, Massachusetts. DC, that's cheating. That's the city. Virginia, Maryland.
But yeah,
New
it looks
Jersey,
like
New Hampshire.
25,
No one lives in New Hampshire. That's also cheating.
maybe 26 million worldwide right now.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit concerned about how high the developer percentage is going to get. But that's kind of a different talk.
I think that Guatemala and Chile are like two of the places I'm personally eyeballing because it's going to be similar time zone to the United States. And so anyone that you're working with in the United States, you can actually like have similar like meeting hours during the day. And so
Yeah, it's a big deal.
Pacific time is the worst time zone. I learned that when I moved to the East Coast. So yeah, anything that plays well with that would be good.
Yeah, because the Pacific is pretty long, so getting to anything else from Pacific time is pretty hard. All right. Who is this still? Suzanne, did you have another question? Or is it the same question?
I think she said that she only raised her hand on accident, if I'm not mistaken, in the chat.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
She said.
So our next event is the promotional roundtable. So I'm gonna stop recording.